the hazardous material. So that's all to say that we hope this will allow us to deal with those hydrochloric acid spills that your neighbor may have.
And I guess I would also add that when Karen?
Oh, I just wanted to add that as you mentioned before, on April 23rd, we're going to be talking about the OHM to groundwater side of things too.
That's what I was
So,
exactly going to say, that when we talk about groundwater, it's oil and hazardous materials, not oil/oil hazardous materials. It's both, it's all
Because we
contaminants.
believe in the groundwater, there are ways that we can standardize it even for the hazardous materials as well.
Right, because if you exceed a standard for groundwater, you're exceeding it, you're not drinking it, or you're not having the option of drinking it because of the contaminant exceeding a certain threshold, no matter what the contaminant is.
So come back
But
in
we will
April.
discuss that at our next meeting, so that'll be an exciting reason to come back. And for people on the phone to come in person too. Great, does anyone on the phone have a discussion question before we move on to Scott's presentation? Okay, great. Take it away.
All right, thank you. And that's all a good segue to what I'm going to talk about here. So as I said in the introduction, I work for industrial economics, and I've been helping Karen with this. Throughout the last 10 years, I've been working on NRD with state and federal trustees under the implementing regulations for NOAA and for Fish and Wildlife Service, which also apply to the state. So that was what you were getting at there. And we can forward those along. But there's a long list of regulations, both from NOAA and from Fish and Wildlife Service Department of Interior, that have implementing statutes in there. And before coming to IEC, I worked for an LSP for about 2 years, so I was pretty familiar with the forms that were being submitted and the information that was being collected during some of these small to medium volume oil spills in the past. So I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview of the standard oil spill approach that we've developed. And as Paul had mentioned, this is supposed to be a dialogue here, so I'm definitely interested in any information that you have that I may not have considered here, or any suggestions you may have in developing this approach here. I'll present the model results when applied to the historical spills, those 517 spills that Karen had mentioned. They're greater than 10 gallons and less than 10,000 gallons, and it's limited to spills with a temporary or permanent solution. This is also just a good opportunity here that if anyone did try to go to the Bureau of Waste Site lookup site and take all the spills from that time period, you won't get the same number of 517 because you would have had to do that on 12/31. Because between 1/1 and today, more spills have reached the permanent solution or temporary solution there. And then I'll summarize the results of historical small to medium volume spills. So the purpose of this was, we've already discussed a lot of it, but increase efficiency and cost effectiveness, expedite restoration implementation. So oftentimes on some of these spills where you do a full assessment, it can take quite a bit of time to actually get that restoration funding on the ground and in the implementation process, and ensure that the citizens are compensated for damages. All right, so this, Paul sort of stalled my punchline here for this slide, but when you add it all up over the years, you get about 97,500 gallons across these 10 to 10,000 gallon spills. And you can see there's a lot of variation from year to year. So some of the spills with volume on the y-axis and here on the x-axis. So some of those higher volume years are due to one spill, one large volume spill, and some of the years are due to a lot of smaller volume spills. And so we talked about the 517 and how we got there. So of the full suite of spills of 11,000, many of them do not impact natural resources. Many of them are small, less than 10 gallons. We also set in a limited area impacted, so if it impacted less than a tenth of an acre, it wasn't included in that 517 number. But several of the spills in that group do impact natural resources and do result in quantifiable impacts. And based on 30 years of NRDA practitioners' work, there is tools and methods available to quantify these impacts for oil spills. All right, so the
Well,
next,
sorry, can we just jump back? So the spatial limitation, that's a tenth of an acre, say 4,000 square feet. We're talking about 4,000 square feet of water, surface water,
surface water or wetlands, yeah.
or wetlands. Before that, so
The area of the spill.
that's the area where you're seeing discoloration, or is that a chemical impact?
So for this to get at what spills were less than a tenth of an acre, it was straight from BWSC 104, and where the LSP is entering the area impacted. And that's the information we had, and so
Yeah.
and sorry, I should have repeated the question too, I realized. So the question was, how did we determine what spills were less than a tenth of an acre? And the answer is that on the BWSC LSP submittal forms, there is an impacted area that is put in there.
Sorry, I fill out a few 104s in my career. That less than 0.1 acre that we fill out on the form is actually the entire disposal site boundary, including, and it's mostly land area. That includes land area and surface water.
Yeah, so if it was designated surface water, we included just the surface water. If it wasn't designated, we took the number that was put in there. And going back to 3 slides ago, the efficiency factor goes in here. So we're designing it to not create additional work. So when LSPs in the future go forward, they can consider this. So conceptual models. The next couple of slides are the conceptual approach that we came up with. This is all coming very much from the implementing regulations from DOI and NOAA, and what we've worked on for both much larger spills like Bouchard and Deepwater Horizon, but down to many smaller spills across the country from on all oceans and territories in the United States. So your end result is this compensatory restoration cost, and you get at that from 3 things. You have your loss, what are your impacts? From that you determine what's your required restoration, and then you cost out that required restoration, and that's your damages. Good point to stop here and just point out that this is not one-to-one. So let's just say you obliterated a whole acre for, think of just a spill where oil got on the whole acre of wetlands and the whole acre of wetlands is gone. It's not just going out and replacing 1 acre of wetland, because we take into account the recovery time of that acre, as well as we take into account when the restoration is implemented. So if the restoration is implemented far into the future, that would give you less benefit today than if it was implemented today. Do you have a question? Did someone start raising their hand?
I think that was me.
Okay.
Well, I'll hold it and see where you go with this.
Great.
But just to keep in mind, I'm trying to distinguish between, I don't think loss and restoration both contribute to damage, but they're not the same thing. So it can take a certain amount of money to restore, and then you have the loss, which is, you can't do shellfishing during the period prior to the restoration. I
Right.
assume the model takes into
Interim
account
losses.
both the loss and the restoration costs.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about each one of these in more detail right now.
Yeah.
Scott, is this
Thank you.
model,
Sorry.
this conceptual model, is this, did you create this? Is this what's used for 30 years? Where's the background of the model?
So the question was, it's a good point, thank you, Liz. The first question was, there's a distinction here between loss and required restoration, and to keep that in mind. And the answer is yes, and we're about to dive into that in probably a lot of more detail than people were anticipating. And the second question was, did we create this model, or did we take it off from something else? So the answer to that is that this was created specifically for Massachusetts, but the overall conceptual approach you can find directly in the DOI regs.
Department of Interior.
Department of Interior, sorry. Department of Interior, or a combination of the Department of Interior and NOAA regs.
Right, so typically, for a comprehensive NRD assessment, you would conduct what's called a habitat equivalency analysis or a resource equivalency analysis. And this is based on the approach of a habitat equivalency analysis, but coming up with either standard inputs, such as the information we get from the forms that LSP fill out, or information that we know from the literature about the way spills affect the environment, as well as GIS-based information. So we're basically using the HIA approach in a standard way.
Right. Yeah, and we're going to dive into all that great detail in the next several slides here. But these 4 boxes here that you're looking at are the standard NRD approach that's applied to most spills or most releases across the country. The trustees across the country do have the ability to not follow the regulations. They're not required, but they get rebuttable presumption if they do follow the regulations. So you may find an NRD document that does not follow the regulations. All right, so the first set of information here is the loss, and that is based on your impacted area, your percent service loss, and a baseline factor. And we're going to talk about all of this now, and that gives you all over your recovery time frame. So how long it takes to get back to baseline. All right, impacted area, we already talked about a little, so I'm not going to go into too much more detail here, but it is what is reported in the BWSC form, and for the purpose of back testing the model, we did not make any alterations to what was in the BWSC form. Percent loss. So the percent loss comes very much from the literature, and it is what is the reduction from baseline, and baseline is but for the contamination. And we're going to talk about baseline next year, as you can see. And we based a percent service loss on the acute toxicity, mechanical injury, and persistency in the environment. And the ranges are low. The low range is 25% loss. So if you had a pristine area, it would be a 25% loss to that area. And the high range is 100% for heavy oils that are impacting that area. And this is coming from French McKay et al., which is relied on for a number of other NRD assessments. And we also looked qualitatively at other spills to see how it met up with the fuel type that was spilled there and the habitat types. And it was in line with all of that.
But is gasoline, that's lighter than the jet fuel, is that, so 25 is as low as you go?
It is a middle point. Yep. So gasoline's another category of oils. So there's 4 categories of oils, and gasoline is 75%.
Right, because all 3 factors, acute, mechanical, and persistence, combine to put the fuel in the different categories. So it might be lower in one of those, but higher in another.
All right, so baseline is but for contamination. And there's a lot of areas across the country, but here in Massachusetts, where you might have hardened shorelines, there might be existing contamination, there might be invasive species, there might be impervious surface, any number of things that you can think of. And we've gone through a couple of different investigations into different tools that are data sources that we can use to standardize baseline. And if you, again, here's something, if you have any suggestions, I'm definitely open to it here and want to hear about it. So what we have is it located in an urbanized setting? Is there evidence of erosion or channelization along the banks? And is there the presence of invasive species? And so urbanized setting can come from MassGIS, whereas the erosion and the erosion or channelization and the invasive species would be an observation that the LSP would be making on the site. we also have to take into account the time frame here. And that is the interim losses, so from the time of contamination to the time it returns to baseline. And that can be natural recovery, it can be, or it can be expedited recovery based on containment and removal of the oil, plantings, dredging, whatever it is that you do on a contaminated site or during an oil spill. And for the purposes of these spills, we did 1 year of injury. And that is based on the time that it took to reach permanent solution. So for those 517 spills, most of them reached a permanent solution within 1 year. So there are some that might extend longer than a year, whereas in that case, the damages would be higher, but for the purposes of handling 517 different spills in one model, we assumed 1 year across the board.
So I have a question about the erosion channelization.
Sure.
And then also invasive species, is it like present